This is my original Game Boy Advance that I was gifted for Christmas 2003, and this is that same Game Boy with a few upgrades. If you've ever owned a Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, you know that although these are wonderful consoles from our childhood, they do suffer from one pretty major drawback, and that's just it's really hard to see the darn things, at least in suboptimal lighting, which is, you know, kind of everywhere. At the time, this wasn't a deal breaker, as many companies were kind enough to create these screen reader magnifier-like things, which were kind of awful, but they got the job done. And you'd think at the time I would have just accepted this as the only solution for GBA visibility, outside of ponying up the cash for the recent release SP, but unfortunately my 7-year-old self was surprisingly tapped into the modding scene of its day, and so I knew there was a way to fix it, which was this third-party backlight mod called Afterburner, and to my amazement, the webpage is still up today and completely unchanged since I gazed at it longingly 21 years ago. I really wanted to do this mod back then, but at the time I was 7, so broke and wildly unskilled, but at least one of those is different today. So today we're going to make that dream come true, and we're actually going to make it even better than I imagined back in 2003. And we're going to do that thanks to two key ingredients. The first is this beautiful NES-style matte replacement shell for the GBA sent to me by extremeRate, who you may remember from the video where I fixed and restored my brother's DS Lite with a very similar shell style. And the other ingredient is this IPS replacement screen sent to me by RetroModding.com, but this is no ordinary backlit IPS replacement screen for the GBA. It also goes a step further and takes over the GBA's link port to give us AV out, so we can essentially dock this to a TV like a Switch, and our Game Boy becomes the controller, which is just so cool. Considering the Game Boy player accessory for the GameCube retailed for $80, and now if you can find it mint in box is selling for like $300, this adds a ton of value to the GBA console itself. Also, a screen replacement mod like this usually requires some modification of the shell itself, but thankfully our replacement shell from extremeRate works for both replacement screens and the original screen, so we're good to go there. So with all that out of the way, let's build this thing. First, we'll unpack all our pieces for the extremeRate shell, as well as the pieces for the RetroModding screen, and learning from my mistake with the DS Lite shell swap, I'll be trying to keep the workbench a little tidier this time by using my iFixit screw sorter. Both of these products come with helpful video guides for installing their product, and in my case I'll be following the shell video, pausing in the middle to assemble the screen, and then switching back to the shell video to button everything back up. So we'll start by popping off these tri-wing screws in the back, classic Nintendo, pop off the back shell, and already we can tell this is going to be a lot easier than working with a DS Lite. A couple of Phillips screws and a ribbon cable later, and the motherboard is already free to set aside from the shell. And believe it or not, that's as far as we go before we hop over to assemble the new IPS display, which we'll do by attaching this little connector here between the display and the control board. And I missed this step and had to go back later, but this is where you would stick that clear sticker looking thing to the back of the display, which I believe is just to provide some protection from the rest of the internals. Once that's on, we'll fold these two together, select the correct ribbon cable for our GBA motherboard, and attach the screen to the Game Boy motherboard, and from there they strongly encourage you to test that the screen is working correctly before going any further, which we can do easily by partially reassembling the original bottom shell, so we can just stick a couple of batteries in there, and when we switch the power on, we should see a much more visible, vibrant IPS screen spring to life. We can also touch the brightness and color controls by tapping the ends of the little touch sensor wires if you can reach those, but the main thing to test is the screen itself. Once we're happy with that, we can turn the GBA back off, remove the motherboard from the bottom shell, and now it's time to get to soldering. As far as soldering mods go, if you have even just a little bit of soldering experience, this was pretty straightforward as the contact points are all exposed and don't require any scraping or anything, and they can just be prepped with some flux and solder. And once the pads are prepped, the little red wires are easy to pop in there. The screen manufacturer's instructions for the correct points to connect are linked in the description, and although their video is very helpful, there's one point that may differ depending on the cable you're sent in your kit, and that's the AV pin on the link connector. In my case, I had originally soldered the AV wire to pin 1, but after checking the written troubleshooting guide, it turns out pin 3 was the correct one so that I could get AV out working properly. It should be noted that to use the AV out feature, you do need to pop off this little resistor here, and by doing so, you'll no longer be able to use the link port for its original functionality. So if you're one of those still wiring GBAs to each other to play Mario Party Advance, well, have you heard of RetroArch NetPlay? While we're in soldering mode, this is up to personal preference, but because this kit lets you control the brightness by holding select and using the left and right triggers, and because I don't want to use any other color modes besides the default, I decided later on to desolder the touch sensor wires, which is very easy to do at this step if you like. Once all those points are wired up, now's a good time to pop the original bottom shell on again for another sanity test that the screen is still happy, and if you want, you could also hold down the select pad while triggering the left and right trigger switches to test brightness, which can be a bit tricky, and I was pretty confident that those were fine, so I decided to test them later when the buttons were in. Now that the screen is assembled, we can switch gears back to the shell swap guide, where the next step is to remove this little plastic prong in the new shell's faceplate with some pliers so that the new screen screen will play nice inside. Once done, we can lay our new screen inside the front shell piece, and we're given this plastic bracket that aligns the screen in the correct position. Now that line took me 3 seconds to say, but about an hour to discover because I didn't realize that bracket was sitting in one of the plastic baggies that came with the kit, and so I spent a ridiculous amount of time positioning the screen just right using electrical tape inside the housing, and then after I had it just right, then I saw the bracket, so be sure to remember that's in there. Once that's in, we can tape down the display's control board to keep it in place and reduce any stress on its ribbon cable there. And while we've got the tape out, I also taped down the plastic bracket along the side here, as in my screen tests I noticed a bit of wiggle room with the screen positioning, and I wanted to lock it in exactly where I wanted it. After that comes the fun part of deciding which of the button options from the extremeRate kit we want to use, slide them into their keyed slots, add the new membranes over top, and then you're supposed to put a piece of protective foam over the screen assembly before putting the back on, but I seem to have lost mine, so I just made my own protective layer with some strips of electrical tape, one over the other, and that worked fine. We'll pop the Phillips screws into the motherboard, and then using a little more electrical tape to manage our red wires a bit, we'll then assemble the bumpers and put them into place. Finally slide in our power switch and shell sides, and then on the back shell we'll add this metal plate to the bottom shell, which helps guide the cartridges into their slot, assemble the little battery contact bracket and slide it in, and finally we can pop the back on and tighten down the beloved tri-wing screws. While on the back we also get this little sticker from extremeRate to replace the look of the original info sticker, and it's little details like this that I really appreciate, because you wouldn't think about it, but if you turned over a Game Boy Advance and saw that the back was just a flat color and just plastic, it'd be pretty obvious that the shell had been swapped, but touches like this make my brain feel like this is one of the actual variants of the GBA that Nintendo offered. After that we get to add the pretty branded lens, which honestly I can't remember if this came out of the extremeRate shell kit or the RetroModding shell kit, but they're pretty similar, so it's really up to your preferences. They should both fit fine. Once that's done, it's finally time to pop a couple of batteries into our new shell, fire it up, and take a look at this beautiful screen. It looks so good, and honestly it's hard for me to believe that this is my childhood Game Boy Advance, and I love it. Now's a good time to test the brightness controls again by holding select and the left and right triggers, and if you decided to keep the touch controls in, then you can just firmly tap on the housing near where you place them to see those effects. I'm already super pleased with the results of this mod, but we still have one very cool feature to test. So here I've plugged the provided adapter cable into the former link port, henceforth known as my video out port, and the headphone cable plugs into our headphone jack like so, and finally to tell the controller board to switch to video out, we just hold the button combo select and both shoulder buttons for 5 seconds, and boom, our GBA is docked, controller is in hand, and we're ready to enjoy our games on the big screen. No Game Boy player required. So what do you think? Are you going to give your Game Boy Advance new life with this mod, or do you have other plans for your old friend? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe to About the Channel, and we'll see you next week.